Before this video begins, I would just like to thank my Asbantium level patron, Fallon Cortez. Thank you for supporting the channel. One of the biggest aspects of Doctor Who is its vast array of monsters and villains for the Doctor to encounter across space and time. You know the types I mean. Big green aliens, gods from before the dawn of time, rogue AI, evil alter egos. There are all kinds of villains for the main characters to face in their travels. Originally, Doctor Who was meant to be a scientific and educational show to teach kids what other sci-fi shows of the time weren't doing because of their bug-eyed monsters. And yet, it's those same kinds of bug-eyed monsters that have made the show such a success over its 62-year history. And something I've often thought about is the question, who is every Doctor's main villain? Each incarnation of the character has run into all sorts of unique villains, but I feel like each time there's one particular monster or villain that truly stands out and is associated with a particular Doctor. So, as my final video of 2025, with an uncertain year of Doctor Who and this channel ahead, I thought I would ask that very question. Without any further ado, who isn't a Doctor Who villain, he's a retired football player, and this is a joke I shamelessly stole from HITC 7s, here is every Doctor's main villain. The first Doctor is perhaps one of the easiest Doctors when it comes to main villains. It's the Daleks, obviously. Right from the very beginning, the Daleks propelled Doctor Who to success, and they made an instant impact as terrifying mutated racial purist survivors of a Cold War inspired nuclear apocalypse. They made such a good impression that it spawned the whole Dalek mania phenomenon throughout the First Doctor era. They would return for 4 more stories during this period of the show, with the Dalek invasion of Earth being Doctor Who's very first Earth under attack storyline, then The Chase seeing a frantic rush through time and space before Mission to the Unknown and the 13-part juggernaut of the Daleks' master plan. All of these stories brought in significantly high viewership, growing the show bigger and bigger, and the Daleks therefore became synonymous with Doctor Who. They were the only recurring alien monster of the First Doctor era, and the first recurring villain of the entire show. Hell, with Mission to the Unknown, they were the attraction, and the Doctor didn't even appear in the episode. It's also notable how most of the important events of the era happened in Dalek stories. Susan, Ian and Barbara all left in these stories. Katarina, the first companion to die, died in a Dalek story. The Daleks are therefore easily the main villain of the First Doctor era. And, it just feels so natural to see William Hartnell alongside them, or in the Space Museum inside one. Not that way. Get your mind out the gutter. If you have your mind in the gutter, you better hit that like, subscribe and hype the video to, clear up your act. And the success of the Daleks led to a bit of a problem with their creator Terry Nation deciding he wanted to take them elsewhere for a spin-off show the BBC didn't want to make. This, combined with the fall of Dalek Mania, led to them being featured less in the Second Doctor era. But there wasn't a desperate scramble for a replacement because one had already been created. The Cybermen. First introduced in the First Doctor's regeneration story, the Cybermen had a different appeal to the Daleks. They weren't just a race obsessed with destroying and conquering the universe, instead these were body horror cyborgs seeking to convert everyone and everything into Cybermen. They were the perfect opponent for the Second Doctor, appearing in the Moon Base, Tomb of the Cybermen, Wheel in Space and The Invasion. All episodes different to one another, and seeing the Cybermen using different forms of control and taking different approaches to invading. The Cybermen didn't have the same kind of huge cultural significance as Dalek Mania, but they were a huge revelation for the show to keep things fresh in a new era. It was all about the Base Under Siege episode format, and the Cybermen were perfect for that. Much like with the First Doctor and the Daleks, it just feels so right to see the Second Doctor standing across from the Cybermen. When it comes to Doctor Who villains, there's the idea of the so-called Big Three. The 3 main, most significant and notable monsters that have appeared the most in the show, and a big part of that is how they each served as a main villain for the first 3 Doctors. The First Doctor had the Daleks, the Second Doctor had the Cybermen, and the Third Doctor had the Master. Indeed, both the Daleks and Cybermen took a backseat during his era, the latter not even appearing at all, because the production team instead wanted to introduce a more natural and obvious evil counterpart for the Doctor. They had toyed with this idea twice before with the meddling monk and war chief respectively, but instead we got the Master, a sadistic, maniacal and manipulative Time Lord with an extensive implied history with the Doctor from before we ever met either. The Master was introduced in Terror of the Autons, and was the central antagonist of all of Season 8's episodes. A clear statement of intent that this was the villain for the Third Doctor. He was a constant presence, even in disguise, regularly pushing the Doctor to his limits with his schemes. Was he a bit of a Saturday morning cartoon getting caught at the end of every episode or just about getting away? Sure. But he very much was the Joker to Pertwee's Batman, becoming an immensely popular, if less marketable, character during this era. He would appear in The Sea Devils, The Time Monster and Frontier in Space in the following years, really hammering home just how present this villain truly was. It's also important to note that only the Third Doctor got to face off against the Delgado portrayal, since Delgado unfortunately died during the era. It just makes the combination of Pertwee and Delgado so much more unique and exclusive. There's really no other competition for who the Third Doctor's main villain is. The first three Doctors are easy, each having a very clear and undisputed main villain everyone can agree on. But from the Fourth Doctor onwards, it gets a little bit trickier. You see, the show was settled now, and villains like the Daleks, Cybermen and Master could just come and go whenever without being a main recurring villain appearing in multiple stories. The Fourth Doctor specifically had such a long era with so very few returning monsters. Outside of the big three, almost every story had a one-off, unique villain that it's very hard to point to one specific antagonistic figure he's synonymous with. Sure, the Black Guardian was the main villain of all of Season 16, but he didn't appear in every story like the Master had done in Season 8, just in the final one, and Season 16 also is just like one of the weakest of the Fourth Doctor era, so it has less of a cultural impact. The Sontarans appeared twice in the era, but not in particularly beloved or impactful stories, so they also don't particularly feel too much like a main villain. So for the Fourth Doctor, I would probably say the closest thing to a main villain he had was Davros. Season 12, Tom Baker's debut season, saw us travel to the very creation of the Daleks in Genesis of the Daleks. But rather than the Daleks themselves being the villains of the story as they had always been before, the main antagonist was instead Davros, their insane and distinctive creator introduced for this story. He proved to be a very unique character that breathed new life into the Daleks and was the perfect, insane and maniacal foil for the whimsical and sarcastic Fourth Doctor. Davros returned in Destiny of the Daleks, having managed to escape his doom in the previous story, and his status as villain here was what cemented him as an iconic part of the Fourth Doctor's era, essentially bookending it, appearing at the start and right at the end. So it feels right to call him the Fourth Doctor's main villain, especially since he would go on to become a core part of the rest of Classic Who, thanks to being so good during the Fourth Doctor era. But if the Fourth Doctor's rivalry with Davros broke the mould, the Fifth Doctor's era quickly reinstated it with the Master's return to prominence. I mean, not only did the Master facilitate the regeneration itself, but served as the Fifth Doctor's very first antagonist in Castrovalva, before returning at the end of Season 19 in Time Flight. By this point, the villain's ability to disguise himself had become one of his main characteristics, so he became a constant looming threat in episodes he wasn't even a part of. He'd appear in The Five Doctors, The King's Demons, The Planet of Fire, and even right at the very end of the Doctor's regeneration in Caves of Androzani, making him by far the most prominent villain of the era. So it's a very straightforward choice here. Peter Davison and Anthony Ainley shared the screen so often that there's no other villain you could really suggest as the main thorn in the side of Five, and the Sixth Doctor is also a pretty easy one. Much like the Fourth Doctor, he faced almost no villains twice, but this time because his era was so short. Sure, the Sixth Doctor dealt with the big three and the newly introduced Rani, but his main villain is easily the Valeyard of Season 23. Introduced as the prosecutor in the Doctor's trial, he appeared all throughout the season because of it having one long narrative. At the end of Trial of a Time Lord, he reveals himself as a darker incarnation of the Doctor towards the end of his life, working to steal our hero's remaining regenerations to prolong his own existence. The Valeyard is such a unique take on the trope of "I'm you, but evil," instead using Doctor Who's time-travelling nature to manifest something so paradoxical. He stands out as something very different within the show, and feels especially fitting against a character so morally questionable as the Sixth Doctor, who had more of a clear darker side than his predecessors. So I think we can safely say the Valeyard is the most distinct, main and recognisable villain associated with the Sixth Doctor. Perhaps the most difficult two Doctors in this discussion are the 7th and 8th Doctors, because of a simple lack of options. The 7th Doctor era, much like the 6th Doctors, didn't see any repeat villains. Sure, the big three appeared, and even Davros did too, but I think the 7th Doctor's main villain is Fenric, from Curse of, well, Fenric. The 7th Doctor is often portrayed as a big chess master manipulating his friends, enemies, and everyone in between. He's a schemer and always 2 steps ahead. But so is Fenric. Fenric is an evil force from the dawn of time with an immense power and enjoyment of playing a game with lower beings, and he's actually responsible for most of the 7th Doctor's era happening. Fenric was first hinted at in Silver Nemesis, but in Curse of Fenric we find out that he has manipulated the entire history and destiny of Companion Ace. In fact, in some media, like The Doctor, His Lives and Times, Fenric was even responsible for the Doctor's regeneration to begin with, ensuring he was a baffled innocent and hapless imbecile, which is obviously something the 7th Doctor overcame. Therefore, I think it's pretty clear that Fenric is the 7th Doctor's main villain. He's quite literally responsible for almost everything we see and every adventure that happens during that era, puppeting destiny just like the 7th Doctor himself puppets those around him and manipulates others. He's the perfect counterpart for such an incarnation. Now, the 8th Doctor is even trickier because he's only represented by the TV movie and the minisode Night of the Doctor. Therefore, sure, if you're going by purely visual mediums, the Master would be his main villain because there's literally no one else. But when you include expanded media, which the 8th Doctor is incredibly prominent within, there are a lot more villains he's faced. In fact, out of all the Doctors, there are almost too many. It's especially not helped by just how vast and expansive the 8th Doctor era is, since it never truly ended per se because it's expanded media. Without having the traditional run of any other Doctor, the 8th Doctor is constantly receiving new material in books, audio, and comic form. In the books, it's definitely Faction Paradox or the Council of Eight, and in the comics, it's potentially the Threshold, but I think the closest place to a true 8th Doctor era is in audio form, which itself still has a lot of candidates like the Master, the Dalek Time Controller, the Dalek Time Strategist, Zagreus, Rassilon, the Eminence, all sorts. But I think the most consistent and unique villain to the 8th Doctor is the Multitude, or the Collective, a rogue Time Lord suffering from what's known as regenerative dissonance, where each incarnation remains within the consciousness of the Collective, growing more and more insane as more personalities and voices are added to his consciousness. This Time Lord was first introduced in Doom Coalition as the 11, and served as a major antagonist throughout both that box set and Ravenous immediately after it, along with the 12 appearing in the 8th Doctor Time War series, and the 13 appearing in the Union. The 8th Doctor also encountered the 8th and 9th incarnations too, by far the most of any Doctor, and it ties the Doctor and the Collective together so uniquely in that regard. So the Collective just feels so intrinsically linked to the 8th Doctor stories and events. He probably most certainly is the definitive 8th Doctor villain, but again, because there are so many pieces of 8th Doctor media, it probably could go very different ways. I'm sure you'll disagree with me in the comments. For some honourable mentions, because there are some extra incarnations, the War Doctor's main villain is probably the Dalek Time Strategist from his audio box sets, both the John Hurt and Jonathan Carley ones. The Time Strategist was a major figure in the Time War, second in command to the Emperor himself, and facing both the War Master and the 8th Doctor, but its main enemy was by far the War Doctor, appearing across many of his stories during the height of the Time War as his ultimate villain. For the Fugitive Doctor, there's not much choice because she still hasn't had many stories at all yet, but I think it's safe to say that her main villain is the Division and Tecteun, given that they're the main driving point of her introduction in Series 12 and reappearance in Series 13. Even before she left them, they're presented as a manipulative, scheming group. There are other non-mainline Doctors like the Richard E. Grant Schalke incarnation, but he's such a short-lived and technically unofficial Doctor, so it's not really worth counting him here. He only had 2 stories, one of which was just a website short story, so I think we'll just get back to the main ones now, because yeah, it's easier with the TV show. And of course, before anyone brings it up, yes, the Cushing Doctor obviously are the Daleks, because the Cushing Dalek movies only have Daleks in them, there's nothing else. And yeah, what else you want? The Curse of Fatal Death Doctor is the Master, because that's the only monster. I mean, you could say the Daleks for that one, but it's clearly the Master in that mini-sode. I think that covers all like the little here and there half incarnations or anything like that. I can't really count the Meta-Crisis Doctor because, he exists for like 10 minutes. I guess the Daleks for that one then, or Davros again. It kind of all falls apart when you have to focus on Doctors that barely appear because, you just can't pick from them. So let's just get back to familiar, easy territory. The 9th Doctor's most iconic and main villain is definitely the Daleks, or the Dalek Emperor. They made their dramatic return halfway through Series 1 with a terrifying lone survivor of the Time War striking fear into the Doctor's hearts, before returning in greater numbers in the finale for a climactic battle in the distant future. Whilst the 9th Doctor battled the Slitheen twice in all their big green glory, nothing quite matches or beats the sheer power and terror of the Daleks in Series 1. Such a truly formidable force both on and off screen. They're true evil in its most dangerous form, pushing the 9th Doctor to his limits and almost making him genocide the entire human race just to kill them. Considering the 9th Doctor has such tight and traumatic links to the Time War, it's a no-brainer to suggest his main villains are the Daleks. As I said, you could even narrow it down to the Dalek Emperor, because of his role as the mastermind behind the game station. Having played the long game, yes, that's why that episode is called that, and created this whole plan to resurrect the Dalek race by using human cells. The Dalek Emperor is a hulking, sadistic figure with more of an ego and considering himself a god. He's almost the opposite of the Doctor in that sense. They both survived the Time War, but rather than accepting and mourning the loss of his kind like the 9th Doctor, the Dalek Emperor sought to recreate the entire Dalek race with this plan. And given that this more dominant, powerful Dalek is the main villain of the climactic finale resulting in the Doctor's regeneration, I don't think it's too ludicrous to suggest he's the 9th Doctor's ultimate foe. But the Slitheen are definitely the most visually iconic of his short era though, of course, you can't deny that, but in terms of actual story weight, it's the Dalek Emperor. Now, the 10th Doctor is a little tricky because there are two clear candidates in my eyes. First of all, you have the Cult of Skaro, Dalek survivors who play a major role in all three series, costing the Doctor friends like Rose and Donna, and his own life partially. The Cult of Skaro, much like the Emperor, are unique Daleks specific to this era of the show, and significantly affect and drive the storylines that run through it. They're very important monsters for the 10th Doctor. But I think his main villain is the Master, who made his incredible return at the end of Series 3's Utopia and became the only non-Dalek finale villain of the first Russell T Davies era, which again shows how important he is. The Saxon Master is very much positioned as an anti-Doctor, complete with a companion he abuses and a laser screwdriver to hurt instead of heal. This version of the Master is very different to the classic Who incarnations, and I think that's part of what makes him the main villain of the 10th Doctor era, because he's so purposefully tuned for this Doctor specifically. They're almost mirrors of each other. One Time Lord who wanted to see the stars, and another who wants to burn them all. The Series 3 finale and End of Time are full of brilliant character moments between these two, really emphasising their history with one another and how intertwined their fates are, with the Master dying just to spite his old enemy. Of course, that kind of dramatic emotional storytelling is undermined by his quick return as Skeletor as if he planned to survive all along, but the Master always escapes death, so it's kind of a given by this point. There are a lot of iconic villains and monsters in the 10th Doctor era, and of course the Cult of Skaro are very important, but I think the Saxon Master is the main one, not just because it was his reintroduction to the show, but because he's so unique to 10, rather than those Daleks, which at the end of the day, are still just Daleks, compared to this Saxon Master, who has a lot more storytelling during his appearances, and also that little moment of redemption at the end, where he helps the Doctor stop Rassilon and the warmongering Time Lords. So yeah, it's the Master for this one. Now, the 11th Doctor has potentially one of the most unique and different eras of Doctor Who, because Moffat wanted to tell one long story across his entire era. There's less of a focus on established villains like the Daleks or the Cybermen, and the Master doesn't even appear at all. Instead, each finale tries something new with very experimental storytelling, which often doesn't work out, but hey, at least they tried. And the villains of two of these finales, one obvious, the other retroactive, are who I would consider the 11th Doctor's main enemies. The Silence. First appearing in The Impossible Astronaut and Day of the Moon, these terrifying creatures work similarly to the iconic Weeping Angels, needing to be observed at all times. Unlike the Angels though, which move when you can't see them, the Silents completely erase themselves from their mind. A really creative and interesting monster gimmick. But these monsters aren't alone, because they represent the wider religious order of the Silents, who are explained as being responsible for blowing up the TARDIS in the Pandorica Opens. The Silents are the main driving force of the 11th Doctor era, an organisation pulling all sorts of strings and causing events to happen. They kidnap Amy and experiment on her baby, creating River Song as an assassin to kill the Doctor, the main arc of Series 6. And the Silents' origins are explained in Time with the Doctor as a way to prevent him from allowing the Time Lords to return to the universe. And thus, the Silents are responsible for basically his entire era from beginning to end, even if they're not always present as other main villains. But they caused the cracks in Series 5, they're everywhere in Series 6, Series 7 doesn't really have them, but Time with the Doctor does. So, that's 2 out of 3, that's not bad. Of course, it does also help that they have a very handy visual representation in the form of the monsters sharing their name. So, yeah, goes to the Silents for this one. Good on you, Moffat, you created an original villain for the New Who Doctors. Whilst there's a clear main antagonist of the 11th Doctor era, the 12th Doctor is a lot harder because so much of its storytelling is thematic and character based. I mean, if you were to go by the messaging of the era, the biggest villain I guess would be himself or his bond with Clara, but that doesn't really fit the scope and point of this video. Instead, probably his main villain is Missy, the only consistent through line of the 12th Doctor years, outside of the Doctor himself. She makes her shocking debut or return in Dark Water, having masterminded events throughout the series to enact a grand Cyberman plan, along with also being revealed as being behind the Doctor and Clara meeting to begin with. Missy is one of the most interesting incarnations of the Master, not just because she's the first female incarnation, but because of how she interacts with the 12th Doctor, becoming the only Master to ever truly reconcile with the Doctor and entertain the idea of rekindling their friendship on the Doctor's terms, which is her whole storyline in Series 10. Missy is excellent as a villain turned ally in that sense, to the extent it feels weird to even label her as the 12th Doctor's greatest villain. But again, that's part of why the label is so accurate, because she represents that emphasis on nuanced character storytelling and layers. She starts off as a villain, and in the Doctor's eyes at least, stays a villain because he never sees her choose to stand with him. They go through so much during the 12th Doctor era, and Missy constantly feels like this unpredictable threat even when she's acting as an ally. Because as we see in The Witcher's Familiar, it always feels like she's up to no good or has some kind of scheme in the works. She's a really good frenemy character and an absolute psychopath, which makes her such an integral part of the 12th Doctor era. Capaldi and Gomez feel like the perfect match for one another. Their characters are like a twisting vortex pushing and pulling each other. It just feels like Missy is the biggest staple and overarching presence during these 3 series, so I feel like it's safe to say she's his main villain, even if she became his ally during Series 10. And hey, given that she put the Doctor and Clara together to begin with, she's responsible for all that destructive behaviour too when you think about it. So, without Missy, Series 9 doesn't happen and the hybrid doesn't exist. So, yeah, she's the biggest villain. When it comes to the 13th Doctor, it would be tempting to revisit old faces like the Daleks, due to their appearances in the New Year's Day specials, or the Master, who made a quick return after just 1 series away, returning to black-hearted ways as a psychopath with access to all of space and time. But I would say it's neither of these. Sure, they're both very prominent in the era, but Series 12 and 13 are dominated by the presence of one particular villainous group: Division. I already briefly mentioned them in regards to the Fugitive Doctor, but 13 shares them as a main antagonist. It's the 13th Doctor who discovers the truth of her origin and how she became a member of Division, before they wiped her mind over and over again whenever she tried to leave, and it's the 13th Doctor who has to deal with the flux unleashed by her adoptive mother Tecteun, the leader of Division in Series 13. Tecteun looms over the 13th Doctor era, responsible for so much of what she has to deal with, specifically with Series 13, or as it's branded, Flux. Tecteun becomes a huge villain, trying to destroy the entire universe after considering it a failed experiment, taunting the Doctor with the lost lives locked away in a fob watch. And Tecteun's experimenting on the Doctor, founding Time Lord Society, is what led to the Master's actions in Series 12. So Tecteun is responsible for that. There's a clear line of causality there. 13 and Tecteun don't really get to interact much directly, but there's a very interesting story to be told there, with a betrayal by the Doctor's only parental figure turning on her and dismissing every victory the Doctor has ever had. Therefore, despite technically creating the Doctor, Tecteun is her biggest villain. The 14th Doctor era is short. Very short. he only has 3 episodes, making it a very hard job to even suggest he has a main villain. But he does, and he shares them with his successor, the 15th Doctor. The Pantheon are introduced on screen with the Toymaker in the Giggle, a collection of beings with vast powers comparable to gods, and some of them even consider themselves as such. The Pantheon are the outright main villains of both the 14th and 15th Doctor's eras, with multiple encounters in episodes like The Giggle, The Devil's Cord, Empire of Death, Lux, and The Reality War. They regularly push the Doctor to his limit and threaten the fabric of reality and the universe themselves, thanks to their incredible powers and abilities. They were core parts of both 15th Doctor finales, with Sutekh being retrofitted as a Pantheon member, and the God of Wishes Desiderium creating the Wish World on behalf of the Rani and Conrad. In fact, the Pantheon is such an integral part of the 15th Doctor era that many people still speculate the companion Ruby Sunday might have been intended to be one, or related to one of the members like the Trickster for example, given her mysterious origin, the reaction of Maestro, and Snow regularly appearing around Ruby. With the 15th Doctor era shifting Doctor Who storytelling into more sci-fi fantasy with things like goblins and magic, it therefore feels like an absolute no-brainer that the Pantheon are the main villain of the 15th Doctor. Not that there are many other options, of course. He only had 20 episodes, so there's not really many to pull from. I really do love how many different monsters and villains there are in Doctor Who. The universe really does feel so vast and terrifying when there's so much out there trying to kill the Doctor at every turn. And that's why I love that each incarnation has their own most iconic and consequential villain. From the 1st, 2nd and 3rd Doctors fighting the big 3 across the stars, to the 7th and 11th Doctors having to combat complex manipulations and conspiracies. I really love just how perfectly some of these villains fit with their respective Doctors. It just feels right to see the 4th Doctor face to face with Davros, or the 9th Doctor surrounded by Daleks. The 10th and 12th Doctors have perfectly tailored antagonists in the form of the Saxon Master and Missy, feeling crafted specifically for these 2 incarnations. And yes, that's what the best Doctor Who villains should do. They should bring the best out of the Doctor and emphasise what each incarnation is about. The Valeyard works so well because of the darkness and abrasiveness of the 6th Doctor, which makes his existence seem all the more inevitable. Doctor Who villains are like wrestling. The hero is made by their villain. The corporate evil and power abuse of Mr. McMahon made Stone Cold Steve Austin all the more relatable as the power fantasy of sticking it to the man. John Cena never would have become the face of 21st century wrestling if the slimy and opportunistic Edge hadn't constantly brutalised him and stacked the odds against him with underhanded tactics and cheating. When a Doctor Who villain is great, it makes the Doctor great. And that's why I appreciate all the villains I've talked about today, because they all elevated their respective Doctors and helped establish their characters and create so many memorable clashes. But what do you think? Do you agree with this list, or do you think I was wrong? Are the Sontarans more iconic for the 4th Doctor? Do you associate the 9th Doctor more with Slitheen than Daleks? Is the 10th Doctor's true biggest villain the Cult of Skaro? Let me know in the comments. Thank you all very much for watching, and as always, I'll see you in the next one. Happy New Year. And I'd just like to thank my Asbantium level patron, Valon Cortez, my Diamond level patron, Valtar, and all my Gold level patrons, Daniel Shillito, Elliot Hodgkinson, and James Aleula Waterhouse. Thank you for supporting the channel.